The Making of a Luna. Previous episodes are available on the playlist. You can also visit our website for your favorite stories. A link is provided in the video description. Episode 6. Theron. Based on the accounts provided by the other students, it appears that she was struck by a bullet prior to having the opportunity to react, placing her at a disadvantage from the outset. Secondly, it is imperative to acknowledge that the alpha wolf is often subjected to suppression. It is hypothesized that the object's pristine condition is the result of its minimal usage, suggesting that its prolonged period of disuse may have exerted a significant impact on its condition. If she were to undergo proper training and were to utilize her primary wolf more frequently, it is likely that she would possess the capability to engage in combat with you on a relatively equal footing. It is now clear to me. I must take my leave. We will discuss this matter in greater detail at a later time. Theron then made a definitive statement, bringing the dialogue to a close. Initially, it was imperative for him to ascertain her rank. The awareness that she was a first-ranked werewolf was sufficient. He could donate blood to her to facilitate her regeneration. He expressed profound satisfaction with this outcome. Very well. Please provide an update on her condition. The students reported that the victim had sustained multiple gunshot wounds. It has been observed that her pack members have congregated with the other students and are inquiring about her. I informed them of my intention to apprise them of her condition. In the absence of such action, it is probable that they will forcibly enter and ascertain the matter themselves. Elias directed his gaze toward Theron, who was already at the door. Simply inform them that she will be all right. I will ascertain that. Theron's response was concise and expeditious, concluding with a swift exit. 10 minutes later, his beta Orin had reconvened the group of doctors. Doctors, I am aware that you have been sworn to secrecy as a result of the patient-doctor confidentiality agreement. However, allow me to verify this claim. It is imperative that the following information be kept strictly confidential: the alpha's name, data, rank, and the procedures she will undergo under the care of the institution. This information must not be disclosed, even in the institution's records. It is imperative that the procedure be initiated without further delay. I will assist Miss Quinn in lowering the wolf's bane in her veins. The utilization of the alpha voice by the subject resulted in the doctor's unconditional compliance with his assertions. Despite their confusion regarding the possibility of sharing blood with a werewolf, which could potentially result in her death, they were compelled to assemble the tools independently, without the assistance of nurses, and commence the task. The command indicated that the knowledge of these individuals was to be restricted, preventing their utilization. As he traversed the intensive care unit in which Elara was located, he was confronted with the distressing spectacle of her pallid countenance, her labored respiration, and her countenance contorted into a frown by the agony she was experiencing. The entirety of this image proved to be a source of profound discomfort for him. However, his reassurance was tempered by the knowledge that she would recover. He proceeded with haste, approaching her bed and gradually moving toward her forehead, where he delicately placed a kiss that resembled a feather's gentle touch. It was an erroneous decision on his part, of which he was cognizant. However, he aspired to undertake an action that would provide her with the assurance of an ally's presence. It is possible that she perceived his presence, as evidenced by a slight relaxation of her facial muscles and the disappearance of her frown, despite her state of unconsciousness. The countenance, serene and aesthetically pleasing, despite its evident wear and tear, elicited a marked acceleration in his pulse. "Your Highness, we are prepared." The young physician informed him that the other members of the team had already prepared all the necessary equipment and materials for the procedure. In response to the physician's statement, he merely nodded his head. Subsequent to casting a final glance upon the delicate woman, he proceeded toward the adjacent bed. He proceeded to remove his coat and shirt, allowing the medical professionals to more easily access his veins. Thereafter, he seated himself on the nearby bed. The attending medical professionals elected to proceed with the procedure, commencing by establishing a connection between the patient's blood vessels and an intravenous drip. This was followed by the re-establishment of the connection between the drip and Elara's blood vessels. Despite the passage of time, His Highness had never required their assistance, and their encounters with him were infrequent. However, on this day, it was the second occasion on which they had been in his presence, and on both occasions, they had submitted to his authority as expressed in his alpha voice. The initial experience was sufficient to elicit a strong reaction. However, the subsequent responsibility of caring for an individual with whom they shared a close bond served to exacerbate the situation, thereby imposing an additional layer of pressure. The blood gradually exited the veins of the subject and was subsequently transferred into the intravenous drip. Thereafter, the blood re-entered the veins of the subject. Conversely, a second intravenous drip was utilized, thereby connecting her blood to his own veins. As blood continuously trickled from her veins into his own, his face blanched. The sensation was characterized by a persistent, distressing, and immobilizing discomfort in the chest region. Despite the excruciating pain, he refrained from vocalizing his discomfort, maintaining composure. For an individual of such diminutive stature to be experiencing such profound discomfort, to endure twice the amount of pain that he was sharing, is truly beyond comprehension. The capacity to withstand such immense suffering is, by all measures, beyond the capacity of any individual. Previous exposure to wolfsbane had rendered him susceptible to its effects. During the tumultuous period of the last war decades ago, stray arrows struck him. However, these bullets proved to be significantly more potent. A thorough investigation had clearly been conducted on the subject. It was evident that the recent events were not the result of a mere group of hunters. A significantly larger number of individuals were involved. It was evident that a substantial amount of tracking and killing would be required to accomplish the task. The paradigm shift would be such that the roles would be reversed, with the hunted becoming the hunters. In the vast and enigmatic expanse, a solitary soul lingered. The specimen in question was a diminutive, voluminous grey wolf, exhibiting subtle traces of black in its fur. The diminutive lupin specimen was positioned in a lateral recumbent position, with its caudal appendage covering its diminutive cranium and its digits retracted beneath its ventral aspect. It is possible that she was motivated by a fear of the dark and loneliness, which led her to seek greater comfort and proximity. This fact, in conjunction with the intermittent, subdued utterances that emanated from the subject, engendered a profoundly poignant visual representation. What is the nature of your current state of being, diminutive lupin creature? The utterance was made by an individual utilizing the mind link as she materialized from behind. Upon hearing the gentle voice, the diminutive wolf gradually opened her eyes and raised her head. The presence of another entity, distinct from herself, elicited a sense of elation in the diminutive, furry entity situated within the expansive, frigid environment. In her presence, a significantly larger white wolf pup was elegantly displaying its tail. The subject's fur was characterized by its extreme whiteness, which appeared translucent, and her gray eyes were noted for their brightness. The larger wolf pup descended to the smaller one's level and posed the inquiry once more, this time in a deliberate and measured manner. "For what reason are you trembling?" She articulated her words with a marked gentleness and a voice characterized by a soft and soothing timbre. "My imminent disappearance is imminent." The pup's response was conveyed non-verbally, her countenance and eyes expressing a profound sense of sorrow and anxiety. "What is the basis for this assumption?" The larger wolf was approached with a gentle query. "The rationale behind this phenomenon is that no individual has yet claimed the subject. The entity in question does not possess a name. Do you possess one?" The diminutive lupin creature conceded with a stifled utterance, subsequently posing the very same query to its larger canine companion. "The name of the subject is Luna." The white wolf's response was received. "What is the intended meaning of this phenomenon?" "It is beautiful." The diminutive grey pup, her eyes alight with a certain vivacity, was duly noted. "It means moon." The white wolf, who had previously positioned herself in proximity to the smaller wolf and was embracing her, responded. Subsequently, she proceeded, observing the eager eyes before her. The inquiry posed to the subject was whether a name was desired. The name in question was Small Wolf. "Indeed, I am interested in acquiring one as well. However, the question remains, who will provide me with one?" She expressed desolation, stating that she had relinquished any anticipation of ever receiving one. "I will. It is hereby proposed that henceforth the significance of the name under discussion be disseminated in a collective manner." "Are you acquainted with the phases of the moon?" she inquired about the matter. The diminutive lupin creature oscillated its cranium from one lateral to the other, thereby endeavoring to refute the assertion of awareness. "Upon observing the moon from Earth, it is evident that the moon will not be fully visible on every occasion. In other words, the moon will not appear as a full moon. Accordingly, the degree of visibility from each phase is designated by a distinct nomenclature. The image of a single full moon is the result of the combination of the sable gibbous phase and the waxing Naira phase. Consequently, the subject shall henceforth be referred to as Naira, and the speaker shall be designated Sable." Elara had been experiencing intermittent sleep for a considerable period. She had recurrent dreams of a particular dream she had experienced during her childhood. In the context of her life, these two entities occupied a position of paramount significance. They were, in essence, the two wolves. Frequently, when experiencing despondency, and at times when she became aware of discrepancies in treatment, whether deliberate or inadvertent, she would encounter this dream. This phenomenon invariably provided her with a sense of solace, compelling her to seek further respite and contemplation. Eventually, she compelled herself to open her eyes, as the discomfort in her throat had become intolerable, although she was barely able to discern any light. It was a considerable challenge for her to open her eyes. She then attempted to alleviate the discomfort in her throat by coughing slightly. She placed her trembling hand on her neck and proceeded to examine the area, attempting to alleviate the discomfort. Her throat exhibited a sensation of dryness, accompanied by a prickling sensation that was bothersome to her. The question was posed, "Would you like some water?" She then perceived a voice of a hoarse quality, uttering the following words in a gentle manner. The subject reported an inability to discern the identity of the person, yet she experienced a sense of security in their presence. In response, she articulated a faint affirmation with her impaired vocal capacity. Shortly thereafter, following the auditory perception of substantial footstep sounds in proximity to the bed and the auditory perception of water being poured, she sensed the presence of an individual enveloping her in a physical embrace, thereby elevating her slightly. The olfactory impression of the individual in question appeared to envelop her entire being. The olfactory experience, characterized by a musky and woody scent with undertones of lavender, enveloped her olfactory senses. Concurrently, the warm hand placed behind her back induced a state of heightened sensory awareness, evoking a sense of shivers throughout her being. The individual elevated the subject, positioned the glass at her proximity, and awaited her to consume the liquid. This realization occurred when she perceived a slight chill on her lips. The subject consumed a small quantity of water, after which she closed her mouth. Subsequently, she felt herself reclined once more and heard the clinking sound of a glass against a table. Expressions of gratitude are extended. She articulated her sentiment in a hushed, appreciative manner. Subsequent to the consumption of water, there was a discernible improvement in her voice. "You are welcome." The voice, which was characterized by a low tone, acknowledged this. The auditory sensation appeared to be in close proximity, she surmised. It is reasonable to conclude that the individual in question was in close proximity to the bed. Aware of this fact, she directed her gaze toward the source of the sound. Her eyes were already clearing and adjusting to the light. It is possible that she moved too quickly or failed to accurately assess the proximity of the other individual. At this juncture, the reliability of her senses was inferior to that of a human, rendering them unsuitable for reliable use. In either scenario, upon turning toward the side of the bed, the most handsome face she had ever seen was directly in front of her, a mere few inches away. It is reasonable to hypothesize that both Theron and the subject could detect each other's olfactory emissions. Her pallor was immediately followed by a reddening of her cheeks. The individual who assisted her in consuming the water was none other than the aforementioned individual, who was addressed as His Highness. The subject was momentarily taken aback, to the extent that she neglected to retract her chocolate-colored eyes, which were fixed directly on his bright blue ones. He remained stationary, enjoying the proximity, and merely elevated his hand, placing it gently on her forehead. "The patient is not febrile. It is peculiar that your cheeks are red. Could you please clarify the reason for this phenomenon? Do you feel unwell in any way?" he inquired, his hand still positioned on her forehead. Her cheeks exhibited a further increase in coloration, though she did not utter a word. Cough. Cough. The sound of Elias coughing could be heard throughout the room. "Your Highness, it is likely that any woman in your presence would experience a sense of embarrassment if such proximity were to be maintained." The teacher, exhibiting a demeanor befitting a gentleman, discreetly apprised the woman of her status as the king's unaccustomed consort. This was his interpretation of the subtlety implied by the term. Upon perceiving an additional auditory stimulus, Elara managed to regain her composure and ceased making eye contact, instead directing her gaze towards her instructor, who was positioned a slight distance away. Theron refrained from making any further inquiries, recognizing his miscalculation due to the unusual proximity. Nonetheless, he experienced displeasure due to the absence of ocular and tactile contact, which prompted him to retract his hand. Consequently, he merely adjusted his posture, maintaining his position along the edge of the bed. "What is your current state of well-being, Elara?" The physician indicated that the patient's regeneration had reached its maximum capacity, resulting in the complete closure of all wounds. It was anticipated that these wounds would have healed by now, and that they would no longer pose any significant complications. Elias inquired in a cordial manner. "I am fine, with only a slight sense of dizziness. However, I am perplexed. I should not be alive right now." She articulated her perspective in a composed manner. Following the fourth bullet, she experienced a loss of consciousness, but she was certain that more shots were fired. From a rational perspective, it is implausible that a werewolf that has been shot multiple times would still be alive. It is evident that, in the absence of the intervention of His Highness, the outcome would have been significantly different. Elias initiated a statement but was unable to conclude it due to the interruption of Theron. "We transported you to the hospital with utmost urgency. Fortunately, the medical professionals were able to administer treatment in a timely manner." The first-ranked werewolf man articulated his sentiments with a palpable sense of internal distress, reiterating her words in his mind, "I shouldn't be alive right now." In response, she signaled her agreement with a subtle gesture, effectively conveying her comprehension. It was evident that her more robust werewolves played a significant role in her expeditious recuperation. Prudence dictated that she refrain from evoking undue suspicion by appearing overly astonished and inundating those present with an excessive barrage of inquiries regarding her state of well-being. "And what is the status of my temporary pack members? It is imperative to ascertain whether the other Moonlight students were subjected to an attack in a similar manner," she inquired, her voice tinged with apprehension, as she endeavored to elevate her body, her mind attempting to dispel the haze of uncertainty that clouded her thoughts. "They are doing well. It is imperative to maintain a sense of composure. The temporary pack members are currently engaged in their usual academic pursuits, and the same is true of one's classmates. The other students, who were in the same pack as you for the exercise, have had a week to rest and recuperate from the psychological trauma, but otherwise have no injuries. With regard to the other packs that participated in the exercise, it is important to note that they were not subjected to attack. It is either because your pack was the sole target or because your pack was in closer proximity to the point of entry across the border. If the latter is true, they were simply unlucky in their choice of target, attacking the leader of the Watchers first." Elias's statement was accompanied by a note of amusement. Theron, despite being in a superior position, both in terms of rank and authority, did not respond to her inquiry. Instead, he engaged in adjusting the pillow behind her back to enhance her comfort, which prompted another blush from her. This behavior was perceived as endearing, according to the observer. Thank you." She articulated her words in a stuttering manner, uttering them in a hushed and subdued tone. It appeared that with each interaction, she experienced a diminution in her vocal capacity. Her typical composure underwent a complete transformation. It is imperative that she cease this behavior, she thought. Subsequently, she persisted in her discourse, contemplating the implications of Elias's statements within the confines of her cognitive processes. The inquiry posed pertains to the temporal aspect of rest, specifically whether the duration of rest equates to a week. This prompts the subsequent question of whether the subject has been in a state of unconsciousness for a period equivalent to a week. She inhaled sharply as she became acutely aware of the elapsed time. By this juncture, Theron had already established a certain distance from her, having completed his mission and being unwilling to exacerbate her discomfort. Indeed, a period of 7 days. We were somewhat concerned, with varying degrees of intensity, about the potential consequences of this situation. Elias gazed at Theron intently, his vision narrowed in a display of focused concentration. Subsequent to being met with a gaze of disapproval, the subject in question refrained from further jocularity and proceeded with his statement. The members of your pack have inundated my telephone with a deluge of messages and calls. We were compelled to impose restrictions on all individuals' access, thereby preventing them from viewing you. Elias exhaled, his demeanor conveying a sense of defeat. He then retrieved his mobile device from his pocket and elevated it, presenting the screen to her. Another phone call from Jackson was displayed on the smartphone's screen. Would you be so kind as to respond to the call? Despite my reassurances that you are well and that your awakening is imminent, they persist in their daily inquiries. The capacity of these devices' batteries is a subject of curiosity, as their high capacity appears to exceed that of comparable devices. They persist in consuming my own. He expressed his exasperation with another sigh, concurrently extending the telephone to her. She signaled her consent with a nod of her head, then accepted the object from his hands in order to respond. Upon uttering her salutation, a conspicuously anxious voice emanated from the opposite end. She conversed briefly with Jackson, refraining from prolonging the interaction in the presence of the king and maintaining her composure by disengaging from the conversation. She then concluded the phone call, assuring Jackson of her intention to contact him again to discuss the matter in greater detail. Despite her inability to articulate her thoughts, she felt compelled to maintain eye contact with Theron, who was undoubtedly observing her closely. Elias was positioned adjacent to the window, awaiting the conclusion of her conversation. He was also observing the exterior, indicating that he was not the sole individual present. The room contained only one other person. It is possible that she was merely experiencing heightened awareness, yet the sensation persisted, evoking a persistent discomfort. Consequently, she curtailed the dialogue to its most concise form. Furthermore, it was considered discourteous to continue conversing on the telephone in the presence of the king. Upon hearing her utter her goodbyes, Elias averted his gaze and proceeded to her bedside to retrieve his mobile device. If you are in a state of sufficient mental and physical well-being, I would like to inquire further about the nature of the attack. He expressed contentment, stating that he was pleased to have relieved himself of the burden of the pack. It would be advisable to allow her to rest for a more extended period. The subject had just barely awoken. It would be advisable for you to return to the palace tomorrow. She will respond at a later time. Theron subsequently articulated his perspective. It is now possible to provide an answer, as the issue has been resolved. Elara's reassurance was immediate, and upon hearing the word palace, she conducted a swift visual scan of her surroundings. This revealed that she was not in a hospital care unit, but rather in a room evocative of a palace, a setting befitting a princess. The response to the inquiry regarding the subject's potential return was an unequivocal rejection, accompanied by the assertion that the subject would not return on the current day. Theron firmly denied the allegations. The individual in question acknowledged the statement with a verbal affirmation, replying, "Yes, Your Highness." Elara's response was deliberate, as she recognized the authority of the king and the gravity of his decision. She understood that disobeying the king's command would only compound the issue and potentially lead to adverse consequences. The query was posed, "Is it possible to inquire about my current location?" She was compelled to inquire about this matter, at least to some extent. Affirmative. You are currently in the royal palace, where you will remain until you have fully recovered, Theron stated in a composed manner. Despite the absence of discernible emotional expression in his voice, Elias would have sworn that his friend exhibited a subtle elevation of the corners of his lips, albeit imperceptible to the eye. Theron's countenance bore a striking resemblance to that of a wolf in human attire, and he derived a considerable degree of satisfaction from this unavoidable circumstance. If the term can be applied in this context, it is because he had effectively transported her to his palace the moment she was sufficiently recovered to do so. However, I have since mostly recovered. The physician has indicated that the wounds are closed and on the verge of complete healing. It is possible to recuperate in a private setting at the academy. There is no need for this. Elara endeavored to articulate her position, stating that maintaining such proximity to Theron was not a tenable option for her. The peculiar sensations that overtook her heart were disconcerting and perplexing. Her countenance, typically characterized by composure and solemnity, exhibited signs of dissolution. If she did not depart, it was anticipated that her mental state would continue to deteriorate with each encounter with him. In the event of a disruption in her facial covering, it would become evident to all observers that she was experiencing a range of emotions, as evidenced by the visible expression in her eyes and face. It is hypothesized that if the king were to discern that her shyness and loss of breath were not attributable to sentiments shared by others, and if these symptoms were not a result of her respect and fear of his alpha aura, then further analysis would be necessary to determine the underlying cause. The following protocol is to be observed by individuals who have sustained injuries on the premises of the castle. I regret to inform you that your stay will be extended by at least a week. It is the objective of the present study to ensure that all needs are met. It is imperative to comprehend the gravity of the situation at hand. It would also facilitate our investigation of the attack if you were in proximity while we require additional information. He informed her of this fact with a contrite expression. Upon hearing Theron's candid statements, she found herself unable to voice any further objections. The individual in question was a king, and thus, he was not obligated to provide an exhaustive explanation to his subordinate. A simple command from him would suffice, and she, in her capacity as his subordinate, was compelled to adhere to his directives. However, he did express remorse and requested that the other parties cease. Furthermore, the protocol was applicable to all individuals, and she was not to be exempted from its provisions. She signaled her agreement with a subtle gesture, though there was a hint of hesitation in her expression. The prognosis was that she would recover in a week. In any case, the structure in question was a substantial castle. At most, she would have the opportunity to see him once the following day, when she would respond to the questions. He was the king, and it was not his responsibility to cater to all her needs. Her thoughts had transgressed the bounds of acceptable discourse. Elias, observing the discourse unfolding before him, endeavored to maintain a composed demeanor. Internally, however, he experienced a strong inclination to express his discontent to his companion. Which protocol is being referred to? The individual in question had never encountered such regulations previously, and he was aware of this fact. He was a member of the faculty at the academy, where he instructed students in the general principles of the kingdom. This included the legal framework governing the palace and the protocols that applied to the royal family and their representatives. In addition to these roles, he served as an executive member of the royal palace. Elias's initial reaction to this revelation was one of disbelief, as he perceived the statements to be rife with inaccuracies. He regarded the situation favorably, however. He anticipated a favorable outcome once the individuals in question had exited the room. He inquired of Theron why he had not been informed of the amendments to the established protocols. Ho ho ho! The subject exhibited a state of internally expressed mirth. She exhaled with a sense of relief upon the departure of the two men. Notwithstanding the absence of her instructor, the young man exuded a palpable sense of self-assurance. In his presence, she experienced a certain loss of breath, as if the very air around her was being drawn out. He was the alpha wolf, and such sentiments were not appropriate. As the daughter of a beta of a mediocre pack, she exhibited excessive introspection regarding his actions and displayed a heightened sense of self-consciousness. Assisting her in rising from her seat and offering a glass of water, arranging her pillow, and informing her of his intention to return and provide her with updates upon his departure are actions that a king might ordinarily undertake. This inclination could also be attributed to his extensive interactions with women, leading to a general adaptation in his behavior. Consequently, he did not find the slight spatial separation between them problematic and, in fact, reduced that distance even further. Alternatively, the incident occurred within his personal territory, and she was overly contemplative. The subject had never established a close relationship with men. She had never had a boyfriend, and she was unaware of the appropriate distance between women and men. Interacting with the members of the pack proved to be a more efficient use of time and energy. She exhaled audibly, expressing a sense of physical relaxation. After a thorough analysis of the available options, she determined that a wider distance would be preferable to the alternative. It is plausible that the blush that appeared on her cheeks, the palpable acceleration in her heart rate, and the slight tremor that accompanied his touch were not solely attributable to shyness. It would be humiliating if he were to discern her internal conflict. The subject's inability to comprehend the nature of the subject's influence on her is indicative of a fundamental lack of understanding regarding the subject's motivations and intentions. Even in the event of a mate rejection, the male would undoubtedly find a suitable replacement, as she was deemed inadequate by comparison. It is imperative to examine the rationale behind her decision to engage in a comparison of these two entities. In a state of perplexity, she administered a massage to her cranium, endeavoring to dispel the encumbrance of her ruminations. Shortly thereafter, she disengaged her legs from the warm blanket and endeavored to rise. She was in urgent need of the bathroom. It had been communicated to her that a landline phone was located in proximity to the bed and that it was to be utilized each time a request was made, although she possessed the capacity to complete the task independently. The journey to the restroom was brief, requiring only a few steps. She methodically assumed a position, her legs suspended on the edge of the bed, and utilized her hands for support, but the task proved to be more challenging than anticipated. Following the dissipation of her dizziness, she rose to an upright position and stabilized her feet. She proceeded with a series of measured steps, numbering 1, 2, and 3. The door of the bathroom was within her field of vision, yet she abruptly experienced a pervasive numbing sensation, followed by a loss of footing that caused her to stumble. Her sole reflex was to close her eyes tightly and wait for the pain caused by the fall. There was an absence of any external forces or structures to which she could latch on, should she have wished to halt her descent. The anticipated discomfort did not manifest as she collided with an object, and it was not the floor, as she was still standing. Her face was pressed against her rigid chest, and her waist was encircled by powerful hands that prevented her from falling. As she perceived the warmth emanating from the other individual, Theron's robust, innate scent reached her olfactory senses. For what reason did you not utilize the landline? Your injuries have almost fully healed, yet you are still quite weak and vulnerable to further injury. The voice, characterized by its soothing and gentle nature, issued a reprimand, yet the reproach contained therein was imbued with a subtle sentiment of endearment. She elevated her gaze to observe him, noting his penetrating stare directed towards her. The man's aesthetic appeal was beyond verbal articulation. Aware of the imminent proximity, which had become more pronounced than it had been previously, she swiftly averted her gaze and endeavored to maintain her equilibrium, anticipating his imminent release of her grasp. I apologize. It was hypothesized that the ability to ambulate would not be impeded. Presently, I am in a satisfactory state. I am grateful to you, Your Highness. Elara offered an apology, yet despite her attempts to withdraw, he remained unyielding, as if a stone wall. To which destination were you intending to go? He reiterated his inquiry, disregarding her efforts to establish physical separation between them. It was not possible for her to explicitly reject his advances, she could only respond in the hope that he would desist. He was the king, and it was inconceivable that she would have the audacity to be discourteous. The objective was simply to engage in a modest amount of walking. I am currently in a satisfactory state and am able to return to my bed unassisted. Thank you. She endeavored to persuade him verbally to relinquish his hold on her, yet he persisted in disregarding her entreaties. He turned around to ascertain her destination and discerned that she was too embarrassed to inform him of her excursion to the restroom. He regarded her once more and smiled slightly, although she was unable to discern it, as she continued to gaze down, averted gaze. The individual in question refrained from offering further commentary, rather, he executed a slight flexion of the trunk, positioned one hand beneath her knees and the other on her back, thereby elevating her. With her legs swept from the floor, it appeared as though she was about to fall, prompting her to extend her hands and swiftly grasp his neck. Your Highness, she attempted to say, expressing her desire to walk independently. However, this was not a possibility. He advanced at a rapid pace, rapidly reducing the distance between them and the bathroom. With the door to the room already open, he entered and gently placed her on the edge of the bathtub. He then exited the room and closed the door behind him. Elara found herself unable to articulate a word of gratitude or refute the need to use the restroom. At this juncture, the embarrassment had reached an intolerable level. It became apparent to His Highness that a restroom visit was necessary. It is also noteworthy that he had provided her with personal assistance in that regard. Her sense of shame reached an unprecedented level at that very moment. As blood flowed from her body, staining her cheeks a vivid crimson, she instinctively raised her hands to cover her entire face. However, this course of action yielded an unintended consequence. Rather than fostering calm, it engendered further agitation. The hands that had been around His Highness's neck were thoroughly imbued with his remarkable scent. She immediately denied the initial inclination, recognizing the impropriety of her behavior. It is difficult to fathom how one could conceive of a werewolf that is not nothing short of exceptional. It is evident that he was, however. It is perplexing to ascertain the rationale behind the auditory perception of her thought being interpreted as bearing an alternate significance. She reflected once more on the matter. Her cognitive processes accelerated, to the point that she no longer experienced the need to use the restroom. 10 minutes later, she cautiously opened the door and extended her head slightly through the opening, in hopes that he had departed. For this precise reason, she had extended her sojourn in the restroom. Despite the absence of movement in the immediate environment, the pervasive scent of the individual in question remained palpable within the confines of the bedroom. She exhaled with a sense of relief, recognizing the potent fragrance that lingered in the air. This indicated that the scent of the man must have persisted, yet a person with such an extensive schedule would not likely linger in anticipation of her departure. However, to her astonishment, he did not fully exit the room upon her exit, but rather appeared again and gently grasped her arm. She inhaled sharply upon sensing his touch, yet endeavored to maintain a visage that was as composed and unruffled as possible. The inquiry posed sought to ascertain whether the subject's symptoms of dizziness had abated. He inquired with a gentle tone, requesting that she not be startled further. The response to this inquiry is affirmative. In response, she articulated her sentiments in a hushed tone, employing a mere 3 words. The impact of the shock caused her to neglect the proper use of the appellative for the king. However, it was evident that the man would not address this error in her usage. Absent the appellative, he did not perceive a sense of distance owing to their respective positions. Very well, that is satisfactory. I will merely provide physical support until we reach the designated table. It would be advisable for you to partake in a meal. The utterance was made with the same degree of tenderness as before. She nodded in affirmation, her relief evident in her countenance. She experienced a sense of contentment due to his refined demeanor. He elucidated his actions, and, perhaps recognizing her previous discomfort, refrained from carrying her again. The table in the bedroom contained a variety of foods, ensuring that individuals with specific dietary preferences would find at least 1 or 2 suitable options, regardless of their particular dietary restrictions. This arrangement was designed to accommodate a wide range of dietary needs and preferences, without causing any undue difficulties. She did not exhibit a tendency towards selective eating. However, she did not comprehend the rationale behind the presence of 2 plates laid out on the table. The subject's state of perplexity was only temporary. Following his guidance in locating a chair and offering assistance in taking a seat adjacent to the table, he proceeded to take a seat opposite her. He had intended to dine with her, although the reason for her absence was not apparent to him. It is not clear why His Highness would not partake in a meal with his family in the dining room. The rationale behind his decision to engage in a meal with her remains unclear. It is evident that these inquiries would persist in their silence, as she found herself unable to pose them directly to him. It would be considered impolite to inquire with the proprietor of the castle regarding the reasons for his dining selection. Additionally, he refrained from offering any commentary on the circumstances, opting instead to discreetly arrange a selection of alternative culinary offerings on her plate and on his own, subsequently commencing their consumption. When she persisted in refusing to eat, he raised his eyes and regarded her. He refrained from verbal communication, yet his gaze conveyed a narrative that transcended his words. In response, she retrieved the utensils positioned before her and commenced the gradual consumption of the sustenance. The man's composure was unruffled, and during the meal, he engaged in minimal conversation, limiting his inquiries to topics such as her academic pursuits and related subjects. His conduct did not infringe upon her personal space. It is noteworthy that she had never conceived of the possibility of sharing a meal with the king of werewolves, let alone in such an intimate setting with only the two of them. Contrary to the prevalent rumors, his demeanor was not characterized by severity or cruelty. He exhibited the qualities of a refined gentleman, and despite initial feelings of unease, the atmosphere gradually transitioned to one of ease and comfort. Following the conclusion of his repast, he elected not to accompany her on her subsequent journey. He departed after ensuring that one of the domestic servants responsible for the collection of plates and leftover food remained behind with her to assist, and also after informing her that they would convene the following day at breakfast. She extended her farewell salutations, yet internally, she was in a state of disarray. It is evident that the subject experienced a slight decrease in nervousness in the subject's presence. The initial discomfort in the subject's environment was not as pronounced as it was at the beginning. However, the subject continued to avert her gaze whenever the subject attempted to look directly at her. Furthermore, her pulse remained strong and palpable each time the subject's face was within her field of vision. The subsequent act of partaking in breakfast was then observed. It is reasonable to hypothesize that the presence of the individual in question would be a constant at mealtimes. A further inquiry would be to consider the implications of a prolonged stay, extending beyond a week. The subject was a werewolf and a student of moonlight. Her strength surpassed that of the typical werewolf. It is imperative to examine the rationale behind her decision to confront him on a daily basis, particularly in light of her previous experiences, which, albeit brief, left her grappling with a sense of helplessness. Sable? Naira? She endeavored to establish communication with her wolves, yet received no response from either of them. She had been attempting to establish communication with them since she had been left alone. The subject ceased the activity upon the onset of drowsiness. Subsequently, in the morning, she made a second attempt, yet was unsuccessful. It is reasonable to hypothesize that the subjects were under considerable pressure to facilitate her physical recovery. This might explain why she was unable to reach them. She would endeavor to establish contact with them at a later time, but at present, she needed to change her attire and proceed to the dining room to consume breakfast. In a previous interaction, the domestic worker indicated that the monarch had inquired as to whether she would prefer to take breakfast in her private quarters or in the designated dining area. It is evident that the dining room would offer a superior environment, one that would undoubtedly provide a greater degree of comfort. Additionally, she expressed her desire for the presence of other diners at the establishment. She observed the attire that the domestic servant had presented when she came to inform her regarding breakfast. She had intended to request that Jackson retrieve the item from her room at the academy, however, the maid insisted that she select from the items she had brought. In the absence of alternative options, she opted for a maxi-knitted long dress. This garment featured a V-neckline and was color coordinated to match her skin tone. The garment under consideration proved to be the most comfortable of the attire, and its appearance was such that it did not appear overly formal, yet it did not appear overly casual either. The subject was not present at the academy, where she typically donned her uniform. This particular garment proved to be optimal, as it did not constrict the area around her abdomen, where 3 of the gunshot wounds were located. It was peculiar that the aforementioned individuals neglected to provide her with appropriate footwear. Instead, they furnished her with a pair of insubstantial indoor slippers. The subject did not mention them, but the maid clarified that it was essential for her to be at ease. The issue would be resolved if she were to wear them. Upon completion of her preparations, the domestic servant proceeded to the door and requested authorization to enter. "Do you have sufficient mobility to dine in the dining room, Miss Quinn? His Highness has instructed that you be approached once more. It is imperative to emphasize that compulsion is not warranted, and the option to provide sustenance in the privacy of one's quarters is available." The diminutive, yet aesthetically pleasing, domestic worker inquired with a slight smile, captivated by the imposing stature of the woman before her. The garments that His Highness had personally selected from a catalogue were a suitable fit for her. It is possible that they could finally have a Luna, she sincerely hoped. It is noteworthy that His Highness had never previously experienced the presence of a woman within the confines of the palace, and he had certainly never been personally responsible for the care of one, as he had been with Miss Quinn. On a daily basis, he paid visits to her in a state of unconsciousness, inquiring about her well-being. It has been documented that the suspect made physical contact with the victim on 1 or more occasions, specifically on her forehead or cheek. Furthermore, it has been reported that the suspect directed his gaze at the victim on 1 or more occasions when the suspect and the victim entered the same room. He also repeatedly instructed them to take proper care of her and maintain an adequate temperature in the room. In fact, he even requested that the doctor conduct multiple daily checkups. It was not surprising that he had been in close proximity to her when she finally awoke. During her 3-day transition from the hospital to the palace, he dedicated all of his non-working hours to being in her proximity. He had even brought some documents that he needed to read in her room and worked from there when he could. It is noteworthy that both she and the other maids were already aware of the existence of the female alpha since Elara's successful completion of the admittance test, and had previously expressed admiration for her strength. The subjects were presented with the opportunity to care for her and observe her closely. Consequently, they came to appreciate her physical attractiveness and referred to her in private as Sleeping Beauty. They speculated about her appearance when she was awake. Their curiosity was piqued, primarily due to the conspicuous attentiveness exhibited by His Highness towards her. Upon arriving and presenting dinner, subsequent to being informed of her awakening, Elara exerted a profound influence on them. Despite her reserved demeanor, she did not exhibit any signs of arrogance. Additionally, she communicated with a gentle tone, despite the authority she wielded. Her mild personality, despite the presence of a poker face and an alpha-like aura, was soothing. She had even endeavored to clean the table independently, but naturally, this was not permitted. The woman was present both as a guest and as a patient. The staff members informed her of her rights and obligations, citing the relevant regulations. Elara was unaware that she had amassed a considerable following, with the maids from the palace being particularly devoted members of this fan club. Following the assurance that she was sufficiently recovered to dine in the dining room, the maid was escorted through the hallways until she arrived at a double door. The dining room was located in closer proximity to the guest room than had been previously anticipated, as they only made a couple of turns before reaching it. Her previous studies at school had encompassed the history of the castle, which had stood for over 5 centuries. Given its expansive nature, she anticipated that the walk would require a considerable time investment. "Our presence here is to be noted, Miss Elara." The domestic worker conveyed this information with a smile. Elara endeavored to encourage the maid to address her by her first name, yet her efforts culminated in the maid responding with her first name followed by Miss. "His Highness has designated your room as the more proximate of the two, with the intention of minimizing your walking distance to his personal quarters and the dining room." She persisted in her cheerful demeanor. Elara signaled her acknowledgement of the statement with a nod. Her facial expression remained unchanging, consistent with her typical demeanor, yet her heartbeat accelerated involuntarily. She entered the room with a sense of reticence and took a seat on the chair that had been indicated by the domestic worker. It appeared that she was the first individual to arrive at the designated location. Upon observing the arrangement of tableware sets, it was noted that 2 sets had been meticulously arranged. It was not possible for her to even sigh, as the maid stood a short distance behind, waiting. She did not partake in the meal, it would have been considered discourteous to do so without the host. Instead, she remained seated, her hands resting on her lap, in a state of patient anticipation. Shortly thereafter, the double door opened and Theron entered. The subject's attire differed from the black suit he had worn on previous occasions, including the previous day. On the present occasion, the subject was attired in comfortable home garments, which consisted of a sleeveless sweater with a V-neck, black trousers, and black casual footwear. Upon entering the dining room, he immediately became aware of her presence, as her seat was situated in close proximity to the entrance. This prompted her to rise from her seat and offer a formal bow. However, before she could flex her abdomen, he had already positioned himself adjacent to her, thereby impeding her movement. It is not necessary to engage in formalities. The subject's physical state remains suboptimal. "Please take a seat." Theron promptly articulated his sentiments with the same indulgent tone as before, and proceeded to take his seat at the table. "You are at liberty to take your leave. We will contact you if your assistance is required." He issued an order to the maid positioned behind Elara, his gaze also directed towards his assistant, who had previously presented him with the video documenting the altercation. The domestic worker nodded in understanding and immediately exited, but she cast a glance towards the table as she passed. The 2 individuals appeared to be a couple, their appearance suggesting a shared sense of style, particularly with regard to their home attire. She was eager to inform the other girls and proceeded towards the kitchen. His assistant, having exchanged a glance with Theron, recognized that His Highness was referring to him as well. Consequently, he swiftly followed the maid out the door, leaving the two of them completely alone. "What is your current state of well-being, Elara? Did you manage to obtain sufficient rest last night?" Theron inquired in a composed manner, taking a measured sip of his coffee. "I am experiencing significant improvement in my well-being." The ambience of the room was characterized by a sense of coziness and warmth. "Your Highness, I would like to express my gratitude for your care." In response, she maintained a facial expression devoid of emotional expression, though a subtle redness was observable on her cheeks, albeit barely perceptible. Her state of heightened nervousness prevented her from perceiving the subject's abandonment of formalities, leading him to address her by her given name. "I am pleased. It is imperative to notify either myself or the domestic personnel immediately if any discomforts arise." He articulated his sentiments in a civil manner. However, internally, he derived satisfaction from her sense of ease within the palace, as it enabled him to extend her stay. Of particular significance was the fact that he was pleased she had not exhibited any irritation due to his use of her first name in addressing her. "The experience has been optimal, and I have no grounds for complaint." "Thank you. It is evident that the subject was treated with the utmost care, therefore, the presence of discomfort is highly improbable." She consumed her coffee in a deliberate and measured manner, attempting to maintain her focus. Her appetite was not particularly robust, and her breakfast consumption was notably minimal. In her domestic environment, she invariably assumed responsibility for meal preparation. The olfactory experience elicited by the culinary aromas invariably induced a sense of satiation, thereby precluding the completion of her repast. In an attempt to deflect the palpable tension, she feigned engagement in a task, while discreetly sipping from her coffee. Subsequently, an attempt was made to take a sip once more. However, the subject found herself incapable of elevating her hand and cup from the table. A sense of perplexity enveloped her as she sought to ascertain the source of her discomfort, directing her gaze towards the entity that had encroached upon her arm. In addition to her slender, diminutive hand, another, more substantial hand was observed, enveloping the entirety of the posterior aspect of her hand. The consumption of coffee should be curtailed. It is recommended that a croissant or a serving of fruits be consumed. It is imperative to replenish one's energy reserves. He offered her counsel, then disengaged his hand from hers, placing a plate before her containing pastries and a selection of strawberries. She nodded in a state of absent-mindedness and consumed the croissant in a silent manner, bit by bit. The sensation of his hand upon hers had induced a state of numbness. Upon observing the subject with her vision appearing blurred, the individual experienced a desire to articulate their thoughts. However, this attempt to do so was abruptly halted by the auditory stimulus of the telephone. "Speak." Theron expressed a modicum of displeasure in response to the telephone. "Your Highness, the items requested to be delivered from Miss Quinn's room at the Academy have been received." The Beta Orin promptly conveyed the relevant information. The annoyed tone perceived on the other end of the phone call prompted him to refrain from prolonging the interaction. The speaker merely stated the objective of the call in a concise manner. Proceed with the delivery of the aforementioned items to the designated location. Theron articulated her directives in a concise manner and then concluded the telephone conversation. I have been informed that your books, laptop, and phone have arrived. These materials can be found in the student's room. Theron's tone of voice underwent a significant shift in its expressiveness, as he informed Elara of the situation. The subject's demeanor and comportment were indicative of a distinct persona. I express my profound gratitude, Your Highness. Elara promptly articulated her gratitude, abruptly shifting her focus. The previous day, she had inquired about whether there was any specific item she could have in her room to occupy her time. However, her attention was primarily focused on her studies, and as a result, she requested her books. However, she did not anticipate such expeditious delivery. She experienced a sense of remorse for having inconvenienced them, given that they had already provided her with shelter. However, she then proceeded to express her demands, which were not well received. However, she was apprehensive about the prospect of her academic performance deteriorating, given the substantial volume of material she was required to master. At this juncture, it would be prudent to proceed. Theron's gaze met his wife's at the conclusion of their breakfast. The response was affirmative. In her response, she did not inquire about the location. A discussion was held yesterday regarding the notification of Elias and Theron concerning the attack. While the other students had already provided most of the information regarding the events that transpired, her testimony was nevertheless essential for the ongoing investigation. It is evident that she was cognizant of this fact, and the subject had been addressed in a previous meeting held on the previous day. It is evident that the destination to which he was escorting her was the room where her instructor would be awaiting her presence. Aware of this fact, she proceeded in his wake, her head held low and her gaze fixed on the ground. It was simply not possible for her to walk alongside the king, such an act would be deemed disrespectful. He proceeded at a deliberate pace down the extensive hallway, and she matched his pace, although she perceived an anomalous quality in his gait. After a few steps, he decelerated, yet he did not halt. He proceeded along the hallway. She once again decelerated her pace, aligning it with his own. Her intention to proceed at a pace that was half that of his was met with his decision to decrease his speed of movement, which consequently resulted in her own decrease in pace. However, as she was still following behind and looking at the floor, he ceased walking abruptly, which caused her to collide with his back. A sudden cry of discomfort escaped her lips as she made contact between her nose and his back. She immediately took a step back, her embarrassment evident in her actions. It is evident that, due to a lack of consideration, she must have increased her pace, which caused her to become agitated. Your Highness, I humbly request your forgiveness. She promptly offered an apology, yet he merely exhaled before responding. Proceed alongside me. Why do you persist in moving behind? I apologize. It was not my intention to cause any disrespect. She promptly offered another apology before proceeding to his side. The subject exhibited a sigh, indicating a lack of emotional disturbance. The subject expressed a strong preference for the act of walking in tandem with the other party, irrespective of whether the other party was positioned behind or alongside him. This preference was noted to be independent of the specific physical positioning of the other party. However, his field of vision did not extend to her face, rendering her presence indistinct. He oriented his gaze in the direction of the female subject and articulated his explanation in a delicate manner. The subject's positioning, which is behind the speaker, creates an impediment to effective communication. The speaker's intended message was to emphasize the importance of the subject's presence and proximity. There is no need for apologies, Elara. She refrained from speaking, as doing so would have resulted in her reiterating her apology. Instead, she made a deliberate approach toward him, positioning herself on his left side. Satisfied with this outcome, he did not elaborate further and simply resumed his walk. They proceeded in tandem through the hallway until they arrived at a door, at which point Theron halted to open it. He then gestured for her to enter, indicating that she should follow him. She expressed gratitude and entered the premises, anticipating the sight of his office and Elias. However, the scene that met her gaze left her momentarily disoriented. This was a novel experience for her. Her state of perplexity was so profound that she remained stationary, not only failing to facilitate Theron's entry but also displaying no inclination to do so. The temporal context of the narrative is the midst of winter. Precipitation in the form of snow began to fall in earnest at the onset of December, and this phenomenon persisted even at the time of the attack, during which a considerable amount of snow accumulated. The arboreal specimens had undergone a process of defoliation, resulting in a state of snow-covered canopies. The absence of vegetative growth was pervasive, with no trace of grass or other botanical life evident in the immediate environment. The landscape was characterized by a pervasive presence of white snow and frost. In stark contrast to the white, frozen expanse of the external environment, within the confines of the royal palace, Elara found herself situated on the floor of an expansive chamber. This chamber was distinguished by its glass ceiling and numerous windows that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. As she surveyed her surroundings, Elara's attention was captivated by the resplendent array of multicolored floral arrangements that adorned the space. She had anticipated that Theron would escort her to his office to discuss the information she possessed regarding the attack. However, instead of doing so, he brought her to a beautifully maintained indoor garden. The question was posed to ascertain the subject's level of satisfaction with the item in question. He inquired as he drew near to her, yet she found herself at a loss for words to describe the splendor of the locale. It appeared as though the site had been crafted by supernatural beings of a benevolent disposition. She was incredulous at finding herself seated on the floor, which, upon further scrutiny, revealed itself to be more than merely a floor. The area in question was covered with a variety of floral species, each boasting its own unique aesthetic qualities and olfactory properties. The presence of verdant grass further enhanced the ambience, evoking the refreshing and invigorating atmosphere characteristic of the summer season. This environment could not be accurately classified as an indoor space, rather, it was more aptly described as a harmonious arrangement of flowers and grass. The presence of Lepidoptera was observed in abundance, with specimens noted on the flowers, in the small trees, and in the air. Even the sounds of birds could be discerned. Upon hearing Theron's voice, she turned her gaze in the direction of the sound. He had momentarily vanished upon their arrival, yet she had been captivated by the vibrant hues and the alluring ambience, particularly the remarkable display of floral specimens amidst the winter season. Consequently, she had not perceived his absence until this moment. The subject has been described as beautiful and breathtaking. Her countenance exhibited a tranquil and serene demeanor, yet a faint smile was discernible at the corners of her mouth, and her eyes exhibited a luminous quality. He smiled and adopted a crouched posture at her level. He refrained from further verbalization and, instead, initiated a gradual approach, taking her hand and gently grasping it in his own. Upon observing his actions, she did not exhibit any overt response, as she was perplexed about his intentions. Furthermore, she was unable to withdraw her hand, despite experiencing a sense of discomfort and the sensation of tingling across her skin elicited by his touch. The werewolf kingdom was not a society in which the ruler was elected, rather, the king's word was considered the final law. Theron's governance had never been characterized by tyrannical behavior, nor had he ever promulgated unjust or oppressive laws. In contrast, the actions of the aforementioned figure were consistently aligned with the best interests of his constituents, thereby underscoring the imperative for heightened respect. It is a well-documented fact that she would not have anticipated that the king, who was generally regarded as aloof and unapproachable, would act in such a manner. It appeared that he derived a certain pleasure from physical contact with others. He had made repeated attempts at such interaction, having already initiated contact on several occasions. She exhibited signs of reluctance and anxiety as she permitted him to grasp her hand. Fortunately, he merely took it and rotated her palm upward. With the other hand, which he had previously kept behind his back, he then covered her entire palm. Subsequently, he promptly retracted both arms, as Elara perceived a diminutive and malleable object within her grasp. Upon bringing her arm forward, she discovered that he had placed a small dwarf baby bunny. The diminutive white furry sphere persisted in its internal movement within the confines of the palm, continuing until it attained a state of equilibrium. Thereafter, it closed its eyes and succumbed to a state of somnolence. The subject's cuteness was also noted. She spoke in a hushed tone, her gaze fixed intently on the rabbit. She was cautious not to disrupt its slumber, and thus, she articulated with the utmost delicacy. The subject's claim that the other party is correct is indeed substantiated by the evidence presented. Theron articulated her sentiments in a reserved manner, her voice barely audible. The atmosphere was so tranquil that Elara, who had been captivated by the bunny, remained unaware of the situation and did not respond to his utterances. I have never previously encountered the notion of a garden within the confines of the royal palace. This information was not included in the school's textbooks. Elara stated, while petting the diminutive furry sphere. This was my mother's garden. The individual in question expressed a desire to maintain confidentiality regarding the matter. She did not often invite guests because she was afraid they would request her flowers or damage the property. Upon receiving this information, she ceased petting the rabbit and, with her eyes wide open, gazed at him intently as he remained crouched near her. If that is the case, then my presence here would be inadvisable. It is possible that I have caused harm to something by sitting here. She expressed alarm, made a mention of the flowers, and then frantically surveyed her surroundings to ascertain their whereabouts. Upon taking a seat, she proceeded with the requisite caution, taking care not to step on any. However, in light of his recent remarks, she found herself experiencing heightened apprehension regarding the potential for damage to property. Do not be concerned, she would not have objected to your presence. You proceeded with caution and seated yourself with a heightened level of attentiveness, despite not having been informed of this fact by me. Theron offered reassurance, assuring her that the situation was under control. Nevertheless, Elara attempted to articulate her concerns regarding the ethical implications of his actions, particularly the unauthorized entry into her personal property, but he interrupted her before she could finish her statement. No, but it is evident that the site has not been visited by anyone in recent decades, which is a significant concern given its aesthetic value. The object in question has been maintained solely as a means of commemorating the individual in question. I do not possess the knowledge to identify flowers, nor do I perceive their aesthetic value. It is fortunate that there is at least one other individual who is aware of its existence and demonstrates a genuine appreciation for it. Pursuant to the understanding that the guest will be residing on the premises, they are granted the flexibility to arrive at their own discretion. It is reasonable to assume that she would have derived great satisfaction from the ability of another to empathize with her sentiments as she surveyed the floral arrangement. He articulated his affirmation with a sincerity that was palpable to the listener. The veracity of his statements to her was indisputable. I would like to express my gratitude for the opportunity to observe Her Majesty's garden. It is a privilege. She expressed gratitude for his consideration and graciously accepted his invitation to visit the garden. However, whether she would return was a separate matter. It had been asserted that she would be able to sit comfortably. Nevertheless, she rose to her feet, apprehensive that she might cause harm to the plant. The subject also expressed a desire to return the infant rabbit to its burrow. Upon returning the diminutive, furry sphere, the subjects proceeded through the garden at a deliberate pace. Periodically, they halted to obtain a more proximate view of the floral specimens. The subjects were all of notable physical attractiveness. However, the most aesthetically pleasing flowers were located in the central area of the garden. The profusion of floral colors was striking, with hues ranging from red to magenta, encompassing white, yellow, and various combinations thereof. However, it was the profusion of flowers in the garden's center that piqued her interest the most. The roses were characterized by a colorless hue, with a white appearance that exhibited a high degree of translucency. The foliage exhibited a verdant hue, while the floral elements were composed of glass. This was a novel experience for her. Upon observing her halt in front of the floral arrangement, he proceeded to offer an explanation without the need for solicitation. These roses are known by the appellation fairies' flowers. The objects in question are devoid of color until they are touched by an individual. The subsequent display of color is contingent upon the individual who initiated contact. As she approached the flowers, she listened to his explanation. The petals' appearance suggested a resemblance to glass, yet she sought to ascertain whether their texture also exhibited such a quality. She once provided me with an explanation regarding the flowers and the significance of the colors it would eventually manifest. He proceeded to elaborate on this topic, expressing a sense of nostalgia. The significance of the rose bush, particularly in relation to the garden itself, lies in its ability to evoke memories of his family and childhood. According to the source, individuals of a dark-hearted disposition are capable of transforming the flower's hue from its original state of black to one of white, a transformation that is said to occur as a result of their pure-hearted nature. Depending on the soul of the werewolf in question, the coloration would undergo a transformation, manifesting in a range of hues, including but not limited to violet and purple. However, the phenomenon would only manifest as blue if. Theron was speaking when he abruptly ceased his utterances, observing that Elara had made contact with one of them in a delicate manner with her hand. The colorless rose underwent a gradual metamorphosis, as if by magic, transforming from a translucent white to a light blue with subtle white accents along the edges of the petals. The color white was indicative of a person with a pure heart, which was the expected color of the person in question. It is highly improbable that an individual would attempt to save an entire pack of werewolves by themselves. However, the rose exhibited a white coloration along the periphery of its petals, while the remaining petals exhibited a light blue hue extending to the stem. It turned blue. It has been demonstrated that the color of the object in question does indeed undergo a change. She expressed contentment at the sight of the flower's enchantment. The inquiry posed pertains to the significance of the blue color in question. Elara, intrigued, continued to contemplate the enchanting rose. Upon hearing her utterances, he was able to regain his composure. "It means a noble heart." Theron's response was succinct. While he did not technically tell falsehoods, he did not present the complete truth. The subject was unable to articulate the reason for the transformation of the flower from its original color, let alone provide an explanation to the other party. The significance of the situation caused her to feel overwhelmed, and she found herself merely observing the roses, her cheeks tinged with a subtle shade of red, attempting to maintain a composed demeanor. Despite the fact that he merely elucidated the meaning, it appeared as though he had offered a compliment. Ring! Ring! The initially uncomfortable atmosphere was fortunately dispersed by the ringing of a telephone. The utterance of the word "yes" is confirmed. Theron responded after retrieving the telephone from his pocket. It is possible that the interruption was met with a positive response. The blue rose had his mind bewildered. "Your Highness, Elias has arrived." His assistant provided a concise update, exercising caution to avoid causing undue disturbance. "Very well. Instruct him to wait in the office. We will be arriving shortly." Theron concluded the call with a concise directive. "I apologize, but it appears that further exploration is currently unfeasible. Elias is awaiting our arrival." Theron then proceeded to inform Elara, who was still enthralled by the rose's resurgence in its translucent state, of the events that had transpired. "Very well." The subject made a brief statement and then exited the garden. The vista was exquisite, and she wished to extend her sojourn there for as long as possible. However, the information regarding the assault superseded all other concerns. It was imperative that the investigation be commenced without further delay. Once more, the two figures found themselves in close proximity to one another. She did not presume to accompany the king, a decision that likely caused him some degree of irritation, and thus, they swiftly arrived at the entrance to the garden. At this moment, Theron once again broke the silence, his words spoken just as she was on the verge of departing. "It is evident that engaging in combat to ensure one's survival and safeguard others concurrently demands significant resilience. It is beyond the scope of my comprehension to fathom your thoughts on the matter. It is possible that the memory of that night will persist in your thoughts for a considerable duration. In the event that contemplations regarding the matter arise, it is recommended that a visit be paid to this location, at least during one's period of residence. My mother, a subject in her own right, attested to the restorative power of this place on her spirit. It is unclear whether you share this perspective, but I would like to offer a suggestion that may assist you in your efforts. Theron articulated his sentiments in a measured manner, maintaining his forward progression. He did not await her response, for he did not permit her to concur or demur. This comportment, while not obliging, exhibited a certain decorum befitting a gentleman. It is reasonable to hypothesize that the intent behind the individual's actions was to provide a distraction from the attack. This theory is further supported by the fact that this same strategy was employed the previous day when Elias sought to discuss the events of that night. His attentiveness induced a sense of warmth in her heart. Simultaneously, the Council's General Office will be conducting its business. The inquiry post sought to ascertain the arrival time of Lady Martha. The head councilman, Albert, who was currently perusing documents at his desk, directed his attention toward the young man standing nearby. "Not yet, Master. Her aircraft is scheduled to arrive at 2 p.m., and she will arrive at her destination 2 hours later." Elias's response was immediate. Following the reprimand he had received on the previous occasion, he did not hesitate to apprise the council member of matters pertaining to His Highness and, more specifically, the potential role His Highness might play in facilitating a match. The response was affirmative, expressing approval or satisfaction. The elder's nod of affirmation was met with satisfaction, and he redirected his focus to the documents once more. "Varek, I would like to inquire whether you have reached a definitive conclusion regarding this matter. The potential repercussions of provoking the royal are a salient concern. He is currently addressing the consequences of the attack that occurred approximately 1 week prior. It is noteworthy that no individual has previously traversed the boundaries of the forest without explicit authorization, let alone committed an act of intrusion and attempted abduction against our kind. The subject is currently preoccupied with other matters. It is also pertinent to mention that he should still be experiencing feelings of discontent regarding the meeting that was convened without his authorization." Councilman Frank Simons was the second in command of the council, and he was asked to provide his perspective on the matter. In contrast to the actions of the head council member, who had the audacity to intervene directly in the affairs of His Highness, the remaining members exhibited a greater degree of restraint in this regard. Council member Albert had always enjoyed a close friendship with the royal family, and His Highness was willing to overlook his actions as long as they did not cross the line. However, it is pertinent to inquire whether the remaining individuals would encounter a similar degree of success. However, upon consideration, it would become evident that their actions had already exceeded the established boundaries, a considerable margin beyond what was permitted. "Frank, the passage of a century has been marked by a perpetual state of flux. Furthermore, in the event of an attack, it is imperative for His Highness to have an heir. The primary benefit of this action would be the solidification of his current position. Additionally, it would serve as a form of insurance for the future. It is imperative to cease the use of the appellation Varek at this juncture. My name is Seth." The speaker articulated the aforementioned points, employing a tone that was notably strident in its final segment. The following assertion is made, however: the second in command had initially sought to employ reason, but as he was on the verge of addressing the head council member by their disfavored appellation, he abruptly ceased and promptly reformulated his utterance, particularly in light of the latter's irate gaze. "However, Seth, His Highness is the most formidable werewolf. What aspects of the aforementioned framework warrant reinforcement? It is challenging to envision any competitor who could surpass him in this position. The endeavor to usurp the throne would inevitably result in the inevitable demise of the contender. It should be noted that such an act would constitute treason, and as the Council, we categorically reject any such possibility. Frank expressed confidence in the veracity of his statements. Not a single council member had ever demonstrated any inclination to act in opposition to the interests of His Highness. The sole exception to this was the issue regarding the heir, which was a matter of some complexity. The recently developed wolfsbane bullets have demonstrated a significant increase in lethality compared to their predecessors, which suggests a potential for 2- to 3-fold greater fatality. However, it is important to note that the future implications of this technology are not yet certain. It is evident that all necessary measures will be taken to identify and neutralize the individual responsible for the attack. In 99.99% of the cases, there will be no problem in dealing with this problem between His Majesty and us. The objective is to ascertain the probability of the occurrence of such an event, given the minimal likelihood of 0.01%. The royal family has historically exhibited a pattern of producing only a single heir in each generation. The family has already undergone a process of diminution, resulting in the diminution of the royal family until only one werewolf, the subject of this study, remained. This werewolf, the last of his kind with the highest rank achievable, represents the final remnant of the royal family. The child is regarded as the future of the nation. We are unable to wait any longer. The elder exhaled audibly as he spoke, then, taking another breath, continued with determination. Lady Martha is among the most formidable female werewolves of our kind at present. She is the primary candidate that has been selected. The subject has been shown to possess all the qualities that are typically associated with success, including status, beauty, ability, and, most significantly, rank. It is reasonable to hypothesize that, despite His Majesty's stoic and stern demeanor, he would be susceptible to falling in love with her. It is evident that if there is a woman capable of inspiring attraction in him toward a female, she is undoubtedly the one. He concluded his remarks with a pronounced sense of conviction. However, the case of the student Moonlight merits particular consideration. She is the inaugural female Moonlight, and it stands to reason that her rank would be sufficiently elevated. Frank inquired, contemplating the matter of high-ranked females, upon overhearing the head councilman's discourse on the subject of rank. The subject's recollection of Elara Quinn's ability was evoked, as he reflected on the bewildering fight that had been observed on his laptop on the day the Academy had emailed it to him. The female Moonlight is a third-rank wolf, as is Lady Martha. It must be noted that Lady Martha is already 45 years of age and has undergone extensive training, suggesting that she should be elevated to a higher rank. It is imperative to consider the following fact. Given that His Highness has already observed the Alpha on several occasions, if he were indeed attracted to her, it stands to reason that he would have taken action by now. The elder stated objectively. The subject's behavior did not appear to be biased towards a specific female. It was determined that as long as the aforementioned female was acknowledged by His Highness, he would be content. However, it is evident that Lady Martha possessed a distinct advantage in this particular instance. However, M. Seth, have you not been privy to the rumors that have been circulating?" The second-in-command expressed astonishment upon learning that Varek would invariably be the first to receive information regarding the news concerning His Highness. This marked the first instance in which the elder was not already aware of the situation. For reasons that were not immediately apparent, the leader of the council appeared to be focusing on the wrong thing. "Rumors? Which one?" the head councilman inquired, his curiosity piqued, yet his attention remained fixed intently on the documents before him. "It has come to my attention that His Highness has relocated Elara from the hospital to the royal palace for the purpose of recuperation. This is a novel development in his treatment of Elara. It is possible that this is an attempt to address the issue, as previously suggested. It is imperative to consider the potential ramifications of Lady Martha's presence, as her actions and demeanor could have a detrimental impact on the well-being of the individuals in her vicinity." Upon receiving this information, the head councilman was taken aback. It appeared that his line of communication had become so impaired that even his second-in-command had become aware of this matter before him. He was visibly irritated by this fact and directed his gaze toward his assistant with narrowed eyes, emitting a humming sound. He then looked back at Frank. His assistant exhaled audibly, indicating a degree of exasperation. It was evident that all individuals were involved in the investigation of the attack and other issues related to Moonlight. He did not have the opportunity to inquire about the matters occurring within the palace. He had presumed that his focus on the imminent arrival of Lady Martha and her current location was sufficient. It was evident that the subject was confronted with a particularly arduous professional undertaking. The elder demonstrated an unrelenting pursuit of perfection in his work. It has been posited that the presence of Lady Martha may result in certain complications. Nevertheless, the situation is deemed acceptable. This would represent a significant advancement, serving to break the current impasse. It is evident that His Highness was acquainted with the female Moonlight, having observed her several months prior. However, he did not exhibit any discernible reaction, thereby leaving the question of his sentiments toward her unanswered. Furthermore, even if the king does not favor Lady Martha, her presence may encourage the female Moonlight to seek closer proximity to the king, motivated by a desire to avoid the possibility of his affections being stolen by another. To be forthright, I would not be averse to the prospect of Elara Quinn or Lady Martha being his partner or lady. In the event that His Highness procreates with an unidentified individual, I would find that satisfactory. In response, Varek reiterated his earlier stance with unwavering conviction. The man exhibited a high degree of obstinacy. It would require a considerable incentive to alter his course of action once he had committed himself to achieving a particular objective. A mutual sigh was exchanged between the assistant and Frank, their gazes conveying a shared comprehension of each other's thoughts and emotions. The only hope was that the interference of the old man would not exacerbate the situation if there was truly something going on between Elara and His Highness. The following is Theron's point of view. The previous encounter between the two parties occurred more than 2 months and 2 weeks prior. The subject met the female subject at the opening ceremony and, for the first time in his life, fell in love. He perceived the situation as a farce. He was already a century-old werewolf and had fallen in love with a 22-year-old Canid. He was now experiencing profound grief in her absence. The subject would invariably experience the presence of her smile and her blushing face in his mind whenever he closed his eyes. It is reasonable to hypothesize that the individual in question would be the subject of derision if his or her actions were to be made public. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.